Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, I have Dominique Hawkins with me from Preservation Design Partnership. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Yes, thank you. So tell me a little bit about your background.
So I am a preservation architect in Philadelphia. I have lived and worked in Philadelphia all of my life. I have an undergraduate degree in design of the environment from Penn, and then got dual master's degrees in architecture and historic preservation.
Was that also at Penn?
Yeah, also at Penn. I worked for John Milner Associates for several years, and then worked at Vitetta for 1 year, where I worked on the Independence Mall project, specifically Independence Hall and the 5 buildings on Independence Square, and then started my own practice in 1995.
And you're we'll talk a little bit more about your firm. I was just thinking, you're completely preservation focused at your firm also?
So all we do is intervene in historic places, and a place could be a building, it could be a site, it could be a campus, it could be a city or a state. But it's 100% preservation architecture through planning.
Yeah, when I was prepping for the podcast, I was on your website, and I did think it was very interesting that you go in and help do design guidelines for communities, because I think that's important, and I don't think that always the municipalities have the resources or the knowledge to be able to do that.
Actually, the doing design guidelines actually set me up to deal with flood mitigation, because what design guidelines are, in essence, is translating complex regulatory actions to common day language. Design guidelines are meant to be consumed by individuals, property owners. And I think one of the challenges that architects and preservationists face is that they're speaking a language that not everyone quite understands.
Right.
And in my mind, a similar thing occurs in flood mitigation, because FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, floodplain managers speak this alternate language. A lot of preservationists don't understand what they mean, or architects or planners, and certainly not homeowners. So one of the things that I have tried to do is actually be that bridge based upon my experience with writing design guidelines.
Yeah. I think that that's important. And I know that sometimes I'll start talking, and then I'll start to see like the homeowner that I'm talking to like drift off, and I'm like, wait, you didn't understand what I said. What words do we need to define? So yeah, I think it happens to everybody, because you just assume that people know what you know.
Well, and the complication in flood mitigation is the same word is used different by architects, by historic preservation, by Army Corps of Engineers, and by FEMA.
Oh, so no, yeah.
Multiple definitions. And what I did to really understand it, and I don't claim to be an expert, but to be able to digest the information that's out there, is I actually wrote myself a cross glossary. So I can say if I'm reading a certain document produced by an entity, which way are they defining the word? And that took a bit to get back to, or to figure out.
But that's it. Yeah, that's an important way to navigate through the all the information that is compiled, but just not what we're doing to use integrate it. Maybe I don't know if that's the right word or the best word. But because the it does impact so many different groups, and to not have everybody using the same language or the same definitions, I can imagine that would be very challenging.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what brought you into preservation and wanting to preserve things?
Well, I started off in architecture, and unfortunately, I will say, or fortunately, my first job was doing, I'll say, houses on farms, meaning you take a lovely piece of farmland and then, plop a bunch of a housing development on it. And I realized I was very interested in the built environment and architecture, but the science and technology or the challenge of doing that kind of residential architecture didn't resonate with me.
Right.
I ended up meeting, I got into preservation in the 80s. This is early.
Yes,
in
yes.
the grand scheme of things. So I didn't necessarily know of it as a career. I met a couple of women who worked at John Milner Associates through one of my volunteer activities, and ended up interviewing there, got a job. And then my eyes opened up in terms of what that possibility was. And I really appreciate, I'll say, the science and technology of saving something old. It's, it's not sort of all fussy traditional. And the reality
Right.
is old buildings have to work today, and to make them work today, it requires the input of a lot of technology that then has to be invisible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that is a challenge. Because it has to be functional, or it's not serving anybody any purpose.
Correct.
Yeah. So, okay. So tell me a little bit about your firm. We've kind of touched a little bit about the things that you do, but what services do you offer? Do you limit yourself to a geographic area?
So we will work anywhere in the United States, and my partner has actually not under the umbrella of our firm, although we considered it. My partner has even worked in Alaska. So our geography is the United States. We do everything from very large scale planning projects to, I'll say, very jewel box little problems to solve. Mm-hmm. So there's no project too big or too small for us to consider. But our goal is to provide, to speak for either the building, the site, the community in a way that allows sort of its best step or its best foot to move forward. So we end up becoming the voice of the building. I'll use the building as an example.
Right.
And try and figure out the most compatible, sympathetic ways to achieve the client's goals.
Yeah.
And the methodology of problem solving is really the same, whether it's a building, a site, or a city.
Right. And yeah. Oh, so go ahead.
So it's really a question of balancing all the desired with what is practical and makes sense and maintains that historic integrity, because in the end, that's what our principal mission is.
Yeah. And I think that if you're coming from a preservation standpoint, that's always like the ultimate goal. You need to, take modern day goals and needs and make sure that you're, retaining as much of the historic integrity as you can. I think that's like the ultimate goal. And it, at least in my mind, should be in preservation. So this kind of got you working with the design guides and things, got you into the flood mitigation and disaster preparedness. And actually, I know that I mentioned it when we were chatting about doing the interview, that we had, we have a viewer to our preservation coffee break who brought your name up to us, and she lives in Lewes, Delaware, and she was telling us, she was asking my opinion about if they have to raise a building up, how do they show the difference? Like that building was not at that height, before, what do they need to do? And I'll tell you what my initial thought was, and you can tell me, if you have a different if you would have given a different answer. So my initial thought was that you would treat it the same way you would treat any other addition to a building, where you would not necessarily make it look the same, but make sure that you can tell that it was that a change was made. Is that how you would typically approach that?
So this is where the intersection of regulation comes with sort of aesthetic,
right?
Right. So here are the intersecting factors. So preservationists have been historically taught that what we are trying to do is minimize change.
Right.
Okay? Architects are taught that you must maintain public safety.
Yeah.
Flood mitigation is taught that you must keep the water out. Who wins?
Yes.
Okay, so they all at first glance seem like they're conflicting views and approaches, and
right.
They are. And the importance of understanding the language is being able to say, what does keeping the water out really mean? What does safety, public safety in terms of the construction, how can that be achieved? And as a preservation professional, how do I make those changes, which there will be changes,
right?
How do I frame them in such a way that the historic integrity has been maintained?
Yeah.
Okay? So there's my vocabulary, right? So those are the three languages that I have taught myself.
Right.
And it's sort of like learning Chinese. So it's a whole different thing. So as we were talking about earlier, every one of those has its own sort of terminology issues.
Right.
And understanding flood terminology is important, because once you understand it and can read their maps and know what they're requiring, and also understand what is the difference between what the regulations require, what the property owner wants, and the impact of flood insurance. Those are the things that are driving the equation. Once you understand what those are, then you can start getting creative about the solutions. But if you are operating in a vacuum of not knowing those, then you can't mitigate something you don't understand. You're relying on other people to tell you, but my insurance company told me I have to.
Right.
So from a historical commission role, you are instantly at a disadvantage unless you understand the language.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
So my answer would be different.
Okay.
My answer, or partially different.
Mm-hmm.
I would start with, and now I'm going to speak flood, so I'm speaking I'm speaking Chinese. I would start with, well, what is the base flood elevation at your house? What is the design flood elevation? What is your first floor height relative to those? And how much do you really have to lift your house?
Right.
Okay, so you have to lift it 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, and then, whatever it might be, and it's going to vary. And then if you have to lift it 3 feet, how can we then, from a preservation point of view, make sure that you can get to your front door, because now it's 3 feet higher in the air.
Yeah.
The stairs are higher, so there's the access point of view. And we're seeing 3 feet more of a foundation of some sort. Now, what are the materials? What is the style? What is the whatever? And how do we address that? How is the property sited on the lot? Is it right up against the street? Is it pushed back 20 feet?
Right.
So all of those start to play into the answer, but I first have to speak flood because that's the driver.
And that makes sense to me. I don't remember if it was earlier this year or late last year. We did one of the gentlemen from Wolf House, or not Wolf, Eastern Maryland house movers was on the podcast, and he was telling me that they've lifted the same house multiple times because the homeowners didn't want to lift as much as they needed to, which I just think is kind of, that it seems a little wasteful to me too.
Well, I I won't speak to that.
Yeah. So, but I that approach makes sense to me because it's taking a holistic approach rather than we're just going to look at one slice.
Well, it's also recognizing that two houses that may be next door to each other have different conditions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those properties at the top of the hill will have different conditions than those at the bottom of the hill.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's really hard, because in writing design guidelines, what you want to do is be able to say, you can lift your house up to 2 feet. Well, that may be fine if I'm in the middle of the hill. I may not have to lift it all at the top of the hill, and at the bottom of the hill, I might need 5.
Yeah. And I think that there needs to be some flexibility there. So I agree with that. And I know when we were chatting, when we were setting this up, you were talking about it's not just the sea level, it's also the lakes and rivers and other waterways that are being impacted with the historic buildings.
So so part of why I got into this, or how I got into this, is I did a lot of work in New Orleans post-Katrina, and I started seeing the impact of elevating houses to meet flood requirements and what that did in neighborhoods. Yeah. And as I moved around the country doing design guidelines in different places, the consistent theme is all these places are actually on water. And I'm not saying that every historic place is on water, but water provides transportation, food, commerce, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of earlier settlements were along waterways.
Yes.
And if you take that premise, and if you, look at current patterns, whether or not one believes in climate change or not, if you look at current patterns,
right,
it is flooding more and more in a lot of places. All the flooding in the Midwest, there's not an ocean for 1,000 miles, but it's flooding in the Midwest.
Yes.
So, and I think there are different levels of what that is happening, across the United States, certainly, and everyone has their own sort of stories to tell. If it's flooding more and more, as preservation commissions, we have to really start finding ways that we can help people to hold on to their homes, businesses, buildings, and have them continue to be useful. Otherwise, they'll be abandoned.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And when you're working with the communities to come up with the design guidelines, are you finding that the solutions have to be very customized to each community, or are there things that you can take to across the country?
Well, I mean, the solutions for a row house community, commercial. So there are row houses. There are houses that sit on, the quarter acre, the half acre, the acre, right? So all of those will have different levels of solutions, or different opportunities for solutions. But there's also differences in the flood regulations. Again, we speak all the languages between commercial and residential buildings in terms of what's permitted under each of those to allow for the benefit of flood insurance reduction. So it's not a one size fits all solution. Although there's going to be commonality in the same way that there's commonality in design guidelines. You want people to keep their brick facades repointed, right? That's going to be the same in all places. You want them to restore their windows if possible. That's going to be the same in all places. But the way it's applied in each place is actually different.
Yeah. And then do your guidelines address how to retain historic context if the building actually has to be moved?
One of the things that I have endeavored not to do is to the way I have been approaching flood design guidelines, which are different than regular design guidelines, is really to focus on the flood issues. I think the Park Service has very good information related to how to move a historic building.
Okay.
But I think you know, I don't need to repeat what they've written in that because I think it's all there. So I will say I give the highlights, the bullets to that, and then really talk about what are the challenges, what are the physical challenges of moving a building.
Right.
And understand that if you move it and you change the historic context, you might lose that designation. And if you lose that designation, you know, this is where it gets scary. Then the flood people come up and say, you're no longer historic. Now you must comply with all of our rules.
Right.
So
Yeah.
So I'd rather focus my attention on the things that perhaps we're less familiar with than repeat what the Park Service, I think, has put in our heads already.
Well, and I when you said that, I hadn't even thought about that, but that is an exemption in the existing building code to floodplains. So that, and we've used that just in like small, like stream kind of situations. But yeah, now that you're saying that, that makes total sense that you want to keep that historic designation. So you keep that exemption.
Well, yes, and no. Okay. An exemption is an exemption. So what it means is that we're accepting the fact that you will not be as flood resilient as you would otherwise be. So that exemption comes at a cost. You are more vulnerable for flooding. So exemptions are good and they're not good because it may also provide a false sense of security that doesn't actually exist.
Right. That is true. Well, and you have to, it does. Yeah. It does. I think sometimes that does create a false sense of security, but I think it's definitely something that people that live in, you know, near waterways that, you know, I'm thinking about Ellicott City in Maryland that's been flooded twice in the past few years. Like, people who live in these communities need to have some solutions or some options that I don't have those, but I'm thinking that the more that we talk about it and the more that the municipalities are realizing that they need to put some plans in place, I think that helps. Do you agree, or do you think that kind of helps highlight the problem for people that maybe they weren't thinking about it before or previously?
So one of the mitigation options that ended up occurring through the Ellicott City dual flood is there was an agreement reached to actually remove some of the historic buildings to provide a place for the water to go.
Okay.
So in considering the scope of the problem, you know, sometimes you have to make really hard choices, and each one of those choices is associated with a property owner, a business that's been there forever, you know, a kind of known place in a community. And the reality is that flood mitigation is a series of hard choices, right? We want it to go away. We want it to pretend it's not there. And I likened it to, there's a book out called On Death and Dying, and it's sort of the different phases that you go through from denial through acceptance of the fact that you're dying. Well, we're in denial through acceptance for the fact that we have flooding.
Right.
And people are pretending it's not there and living the high life, but the reality is a lot of places we currently enjoy, you know, our children, so to speak, will not be enjoying when they grow up. Yeah. And at current, the way we value or put value on land as a commodity or property as a commodity to give to our children, you know, sort of the inheritance kind of thought process. As places flood more and more, their value decreases and it will cause problems.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think that's I don't think that a lot of people, I don't think it's something that people focus on in day to day. And I think it's something that maybe needs to be brought up more in all the changes that are happening within the climate, not just the flooding, but the flooding is something that I know is happening more and more than it did before.
Well, I know an architect, and she has been looking into flood mitigation, and she lives outside of Norfolk. And so her property, her neighborhood floods regularly, and she actually sat her children down and said, you know, we love our house and we're staying here as long as we can, but don't expect to get any inheritance out of it.
Yeah.
That's a hard conversation.
That is, yeah. Yeah. And to know that it'll all just be, you know, underwater.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what challenges or trends do you see in preservation?
In the whole profession?
All right, whatever you want to pick.
That's an open-ended question. Well, I'm gonna focus this down to the flood issues,
Sure.
because I think that is the topic for which you called me, and so I don't think I can speak for the whole profession at the moment. So one of the challenges that I see relative to the marrying of flood mitigation and preservation is that there is this general denial about the fact that it's happening. I mean, people are sort of starting to wake up, but they're waking up, you know, block by block, community by neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community, and there's still this big sense that it's somebody else's problem and it won't happen to me. And the reality is it takes an Ellicott City-like storm to really kind of jolt us into action. And by then it's almost, I won't say too late, but it's unfortunate that the option to do things incrementally is lost. And it's only as a reaction to a recovery situation after a flood that you're really starting to think about it or have the discussions as a community.
Right.
So I will liken it to the American with Disabilities Act. So we all freaked out when the ramps started going on buildings, and then we all realized that we can actually design nice ramps, and then we can put them in ways that maybe, you know, isn't a slab of concrete across the front of the building.
Right.
So now we have this new challenge of how do we deal with whatever the mitigation measures are for flood, and there are different ones. So elevation is certainly one of them and most common upon for residential buildings. But how do we deal with all of the different flood mitigation choices and minimize their impact on the historic character of the places we love? And at the moment, or when the flood hits and we're in recovery mode, the people who are making that choices are floodplain managers, not preservationists.
Right. And so that they care less about the buildings and about the historic places than they care about, you know, we need to stop the flood from happening.
They care about public safety above buildings. So, but if we can collectively make our buildings safer, then the level of impact immediately post-flood will be less.
Yeah, that really makes sense.
It requires a proactive attention that it is currently not getting.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Is there anything that you wanted to cover that I didn't remember to ask you, or that you thought of while we were talking?
So, you know, I've talked on this subject. I've written on this subject probably more than most preservation architects, I would argue, and talked on it quite a bit. I think the thing to keep in mind is that all historic places have evolved over time. There's no longer horses and buggies running down the center of roads. You know, we put wings on buildings for toilet rooms and, you know, bathrooms and all of those. Things change over time, and we preservationists as a community really need to step back and say, you know, it's okay for things to change. We just have to manage that change in a way that saves the historic resource over time and keeps people and property safe. However, we also have to acknowledge that there are going to be some places that it may not make sense to keep anymore.
Right. And those hard choices.
Those are the hard choices. And I think trying to be practical about what that is, understanding that each one of those is tied to a person, a family, a community, and maybe something that's much beloved locally, is the conversation I would rather have before the disaster than after.
Right. And not that it won't be emotional, but I think the decisions could be made in a more, maybe, I don't know, like they could be made in a way that it's not, we're just going to take this from you because, this happened. It can be, maybe you can get buy-in, hopefully, before you're going in and taking things by eminent domain and causing, all kinds of hard feelings.
Right. And it's also there, we've focused on in this talk really about mitigation at the property level. There is community-wide mitigation
Right.
that can occur, and that requires participation and buy-in by the people who live there. Yeah. But first we have to speak the language. We have to start to understand the rules and be able to participate in those conversations in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I agree. So is there anything that you would like to promote? Are you doing any seminars or anything? I know that life is kind of upside down right now. So I didn't know if you have anything that you're doing that you wanted to mention.
So I did recently, and I apologize, I don't have dates in front of me. I recently did a seminar for Preservation Delaware on, I'll say, part 1 of flood mitigation.
Okay.
And my understanding is that's available on their website. Part 2 is going to focus on actual individual properties and mitigation options, and that's going to be on September the 16th, I believe, at noon.
Okay. I will make sure that we have links to the Preservation Delaware website on our website when this goes up, so that that people can find it and watch those webinars. And how can our listeners contact you?
Well, let me give you one more.
Oh, sure.
So
Definitely.
I've also been working with the state of New Jersey and Rutgers University in doing a series of flood mitigation talks. One has been done, and that was probably in June. I don't know if it's available or not, but we're going to have 2 more coming up, probably October and November. Those dates have yet to be scheduled.
Okay, very good. And would that be on the Rutgers University website probably?
Yeah, it's through Rutgers University, and I could send you their continuing education seminar page, and once we get a date.
Okay, that would be great, because we'll make sure that we have those on the website too for anybody who wants to attend. Okay, and then how can our listeners contact you?
Well, in the age of COVID, email's best. So my email address is dhawkins@pdparchitects.com.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I enjoyed our discussion. I feel like I learned some things and some more vocabulary words and ways to explain what's happening. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, it was a pleasure. So thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.